Welcome to Quadrant Chamber's first event at London International Shipping Week 2025. As we all know, the shipping and shipbuilding industries are dealing with an era of tariffs, geopolitical instability, and climate change regulation. Put that together with increasingly polarized and political responses to these conditions across the world, and we have our headwinds of change for the purposes of our panel discussion today. Although we do realise that there is some interplay between these various changes and that you as our clients are dealing with them simultaneously. As contract and dispute resolution lawyers, we tend to put these changes and the challenges that you face created by sanctions, tariffs, decarbonisation and war risks, for example, into their individual boxes. And that probably reflects how they come across our desks. So we're going to continue putting them in their boxes today, and let me introduce our panel and their chosen subject box for discussion. First of all, I have James Turner Casey sitting next to me, who's a colleague from Quadrant Chambers. James receives instructions across the full range of shipping disputes, but in the context of today's discussion, I should perhaps highlight his wealth of experience in shipbuilding disputes. And I know everything I know about shipbuilding thanks to James and 3 weeks in China spent with him. James has also been at the forefront of barristers dealing with environmental aspects of shipping. He's spoken widely on the subject, and he is a contributor to a book on maritime decarbonisation, which is a practical toolkit, and I do recommend it if you're interested. In the directories, James is noted as being an excellent advocate, top drawer, and his attention to detail is described as second to none, whilst he can also make complex points in simple and a persuasive way, all of which I'm sure will benefit from as he tackles the topics of tariffs and decarbonisation. At the very end of the stage is Koye Akoni, another colleague from Quadrant Chambers. Before joining us, he spent 2 years at a litigation team at an oil major, and since he joined Quadrant, his practice in the fields of international trade, energy and shipping have gone from strength to strength. In his early days, Koye was described in the directories as a rising star and a good public speaker. Unfortunately, only one of those is still true today. He's still a good public speaker, but his star has absolutely risen because in the latest directories, it's noted that he can hold his own against any KC and is described as not being daunted by any seemingly difficult case. So these are all qualities which will stand him in good stead when he follows James to give us his insight into sanctions. To complete our panel, we have Edward Liu, a partner at Haiwen and Partners in the Hong Kong office, and he's qualified in 3 jurisdictions, England, Hong Kong, and China. Edward has extensive experience across all shipping disputes, including shipbuilding claims, including Chinese shipyards. And in addition, he is a principal representative of the ICS China Liaison Office and the Shanghai Representative Office, and in those capacities has actively contributed to discussions and formulations of conventions and regulations within the IMO. Edward is consistently recommended in the directories and shipping publications as a leading lawyer, both in dispute resolution and in shipping. In particular, from 2019 to 2021, he was named as one of Lloyd's List top 10 global maritime lawyers. That's 3 consecutive years, and he's the only lawyer of mainland Chinese background worldwide to receive this distinction. We are extremely fortunate to have Edward with us today to offer us the Far East perspective on the topics of tariffs, sanctions, and geopolitical instability. So James, starting with you. What has changed, and in particular, what's changed in the areas of tariffs and decarbonisation?
Well, thank you, Nichola. I'm going to go back a bit to 1992. 1992 was the year that I started work as a tenant in the chambers now known as Quadrant. Even more famously, perhaps, it was also the publication year of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. And his thesis, famously, was that we had reached the, quote, end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, unquote. Well, my tenancy at Quadrant may have fared better than Fukuyama's conceit, but for a while at least, it looked like he was onto something, at least so far as shipping disputes were concerned. in the 90s, globalisation took an ever stronger hold. Markets were smooth, disputes were relatively few. But from the millennium, the seas started getting choppier. The hot market that preceded the financial crash saw a marked uptick in market-driven disputes. And I think for those of us like me who started work at that time, that brought home a truism of our sort of practice, which is that how busy you are is to a very great extent influenced by what's going on in the market. The markets are going steeply up or steeply down. There are market-driven disputes. Where they're just bubbling along nicely, you've actually got to wait for stuff to happen. The 2008 crash itself brought an absolute tsunami of disputes, particularly in shipbuilding, forward freight agreements, and contracts for freightment. And it took about half the decade that followed to sort those out. Since the start of this decade, shipping, which to my mind is always the canary in the coal mine of the world economy, has been subjected to what has now become an accelerating and self-reinforcing vortex of direct and indirect challenges. Now, part of that was COVID, but COVID is now behind us, and obviously COVID presented incredible difficulties and incredible opportunities to different aspects of the shipping industry. But put those aside, challenges now come in essentially two main flavors, to my mind: regulatory and geopolitical, giving rise to a slew of second-order operational, financial, and contractual issues. As Nichola has said, although we are disputes lawyers, we're not insensible to the interplay between these various phenomena. Earlier this month, for example, the Trump administration threatened tariffs against those who do not reject the IMO's decarbonization legislation, which is due to be debated next month. I'll come back to that. But first off, let me address tariffs. Now, under the heading of tariffs, I'm going to include port charges. From the perspective of shipbuilding and ship finance in particular, the US port charges on Chinese-built and Chinese-owned tonnage may prove every bit as seismic as import tariffs. You think it may cost $1, $2, $3 million per port call, depending on the size of your ship, and depending on whether it's Chinese-built or Chinese-owned or both. And you consider a container ship that may want to call at 2 or 3 different ports, that's going to add up to quite a sum over time. After the financial crash, of course, the Chinese stepped into the void created by the exit from ship finance of many European banks, I mean, the exit from existence, some of them. And they kept shipbuilding yards afloat, even when almost no contracts were being signed, certainly in the sort of second half of the 2010s. Now, the current US administration wants to upend all this just as sorely as it wants to reshore, it would seem, the great bulk of US manufacturing that has been offshored over the previous decades. And this is inevitably resulting in some investment changes. And for example, you will all have heard of Hanwha's announcement late last month that it's planning to put not the initially announced 70 million, but $5 billion into its Philly shipyard, aiming to increase its annual output from currently a little under 2 vessels a year to over 20. It's also, that is, the changes are also leading to changes in routing and vessel deployment, with leading lines trying to ensure that their China-connected tonnage doesn't call at US ports. We are entering a time of what one might call box ship Jenga. The relevance of all of this to shipping and shipbuilding disputes is, or at least should be, uncertainty. Generally speaking, no one likes to invest when the outlook is uncertain. And that makes the current order book ratio for container ships, which is now the highest it's been since 2010, at over 31%, look precarious. If there isn't a concerted effort to scrap older tonnage, and with the notable exception of LNG carriers, which are now being recycled at a greater rate than ever before, in essence, there's almost no scrapping going on at all, particularly of box ships. Without that, oversupply looks inevitable, even without a decline in trade volumes. And so we may reach a point, possibly quite soon, where exiting an expensive shipbuilding contract may become an attractive alternative to scrapping a midlife vessel, particularly if the IMO's decarbonisation legislation is held up or even shot down entirely. Because one of the incentives to renew your tonnage is because a lot of the newer tonnage is capable of burning not just fossil fuels, but LNG, and hopefully in the future, what is snappily known in Fuel EU Maritime as RNFBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. You heard it here first, unless you didn't. And obviously, if that's gone, then the incentive to renew your tonnage will reduce, and ditto if the trade volumes don't look like being enough. Now, I wouldn't say that we're looking at a return to the disputes flood of the early 2010s, but it does seem equally improbable that the headwinds and countercurrents from tariffs and port charges won't themselves generate at least an accompanying disputes squall. And that brings me, not terribly neatly, but it brings me to decarbonisation. Now, you'll all be familiar, and if you're not, I'll speak to me afterwards, with the array of decarbonisation legislation that already confronts the industry. We've got ED, we've got EEXI, we've got the still strangely toothless CII, we've got EU ETS, Fuel EU Maritime, and we've got, some would say hopefully, some would say please not, the forthcoming IMO regime. Now, the two of those that are currently getting the most airtime are Fuel EU Maritime and next month's IMO MEPC meeting, with the US administration doing its best to disrupt or destroy the latter. But even something as odd and both innocuous and irritating as CII is having real world consequences. There was a commercial court decision only last year in which the issue was, have the parties reached a binding agreement? Now, we know that sort of dispute, it's standard fare. The court's answer was no, there was no binding agreement, and it examined the negotiations to see what had been going on. And one of the clauses that the parties had fallen out over and really not been able to reach a consensus was a CII clause. And the difference between a binding commitment to redeliver the ship in conditions C or better was unacceptable to the charterer, who was only prepared to go as far as best endeavours. Now, conceptually, there's not that much between the two, but it was enough to prevent a charter party coming into existence. As for Fuel EU and its still nascent IMO cousin, this is causing difficulties and real challenges in the market, even before the end of the first reporting period. The challenge appears to be around pooling, in that everybody, owners and charterers alike, wants to be able to take advantage of vessels that can or will generate compliance surpluses, but no one wants to be left holding the baby of compliance deficit. And I've written advices in the last few months for both owners and charterers who are on opposite sides of this debate, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I think there is a prospect of disputes arising because of the great variety of clauses out there, which attempt to address Fuel EU sort of in advance and in concept, but haven't really grappled with the substance of the regulation. And worse still, there are clauses out there which have grappled with the substance of the regulation. And BIMCO apart, I haven't yet met a single clause which really does that coherently, let alone well. So we've got a lack of clear market practice, and that's combined with the difficulties which exist anyway of matching reporting periods to charter periods, because unless your charter period is a calendar year, okay, I've only been doing this for 32 years, but I have yet to see a calendar year charter party. There is always going to be an overlap. On top of that, and supposing that the IMO regime will be passed next month, will the two regimes then operate side by side, or will Fuel EU be phased out? it does seem absurd to have two distinct regimes, which are in essence regulating the same thing, but require similar but slightly different data to be reported to different people, and each generating different consequences for non-compliance. That seems a bit mad. On the other hand, the EU has been leading the way on maritime decarbonisation for quite some time now. It's probably less vulnerable to than the IMO, maybe, to threats of retributory tariffs if the MEPC backs itself next month. And so one can't see the EU putting down its cudgels and walking away just yet. All of this creates significant uncertainty for owners considering whether to order new tonnage or to whom they might charter it or on what terms, and for charterers likewise. At the very least, the decarbonisation legislation is giving rise to real disagreements in the market, which may well spill over into contractual disputes in due course. And just as a sort of coda to that, if you think about it, if you are trading to the EU and therefore know that at least half of your voyage is going to be subject to EU ETS or Fuel EU Maritime, the temptation will be to not to burn your very low sulfur fuel oil that's in bunker tank 1, and instead to burn your biofuel blend that's in bunker tank 2. That's perfectly sensible, except that, as we know, and those of us who do that sort of exciting dispute quite a bit will know, very low sulfur fuel oil is unstable at the best of times. And if you put off burning it for longer than you have to, the prospect of it effectively going off and you not being able to burn it, and then that gives rise to a dispute with the charterer who provided it, who may no longer be the charterer of the vessel, etc., is I was going to say terrible, but that would be disingenuous, enhanced. So that's one of the sort of side effects that this decarbonisation legislation may have in an entirely unlooked for way. Contrary to Mr. Fukuyama, I think we continue to live in interesting times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Koye, we've had some insight into the changes and possible disputes coming out of tariffs and decarbonisation. What insight can you give us on the sanctions landscape?
Good morning, everybody. The sanctions area that I'm going to talk about is what I describe as the concerted and somewhat successful attempts to circumvent sanctions, particularly in the carriage of sanctioned oil cargoes. I know once I say that, people are going to think about dark fleets and shadow fleets and variously named fleets. And they will think so primarily in the context of the Russian oil price cap. But I think an interesting place to start is to bear in mind what I'm sure many people here already are firmly aware of, that attempting to circumvent sanctions in the context of oil cargoes is not particularly new, nor is it peculiar to Russian oil price cap circumvention. It was and continues to be something that was very prevalent in the context of Iranian sanctions. And I think because the Russian oil price cap gets so much oxygen at the moment, people forget that there's still blanket US sanctions on Iran. And actually, as some of you will have heard recently, England, Germany, and France have all decided to start the process of reimposing UN sanctions on Iran. So that's another part of the sanctions puzzle we're all going to have to be dealing with going forward. I think the Iranian sanctions circumvention is quite interesting as a starting point for two reasons. One, it emphasizes where the real power of sanctions come from when you look at the sorts of cases that we've seen and continue to see, and I'll explain that in a moment. And the second point is that the sorts of disputes that we've seen in the Iranian sanctions circumvention side give us a good idea of what we may probably already seeing, but will continue to see from the perspective of the Russian oil price cap circumvention. So what sort of cases do we see on the Iranian sanctions circumvention side? Certainly the cases that I've seen, and I'm sure some people in this room, tend to have a disturbingly similar fact pattern. There'll be a vessel that usually operates in what I will describe as the mainstream market. So it's a bona fide participant in the international shipping market, and it gets chartered or ordered to go lift a cargo, which is said to be Iraqi crude oil or Malaysian blend oil, usually by way of STS, offshore, United Arab Emirates somewhere or Malaysia somewhere. As it's completing its loading or during the course of loading, a body, or I like to call them a mysterious organization, called the United Against Nuclear Iran will turn up and inform the vessel, the club, flag state authorities that the cargo being loaded or that has been loaded onto the vessel is in fact Iranian oil and not Iraqi oil. And what tends to have happened is that either the vessel, the mother vessel from which the cargo is being loaded on the STS or a storage unit will have gone over to Iran to load the cargo, spoofed its AIS, pretending to be loading the cargo offshore Iraq. And so that way, try to pretend that the cargo is Iraqi. But UANI will have used satellite coverage to be able to work out that this is what in fact happened. Now, what happens next, I think, is where the power of is what illustrates to me at least where the power of sanctions really lie. Invariably, the vessel owners will very shortly afterwards self-report to OFAC and ask OFAC what they're supposed to do. There'll then be discussions between OFAC, the DOJ, vessel ownership. And what then tends to happen is the DOJ will direct that the vessel comes over to the United States, sails over with the cargo on board, and discharge the cargo, so Galveston, Houston, somewhere in Louisiana, to the direction of the DOJ. Now, despite the fact that in a lot of those cases, there is no jurisdictional link between the US legal system and anything to do with the trade. Owners have no relationship with the United States, cargo interests, no relationship with the United States, load port somewhere far away from the US, discharge port somewhere far away from the US. In many of the cases, and I've seen cases where the vessel don't comply, but in many of the cases, the vessel will comply. And again, this is despite the real risk of being subsequently found liable for having converted the cargo of cargo interests. And obviously the reason that they do that is because of the real fear of having secondary sanctions imposed on them. Now, as I say, these people are bona fide participants in the mainstream market. And so they subsequently want to be able to lift oil major cargo. They want to be able to call at US ports or US allied ports. And so because of the risk of ruining their business arising from secondary sanctions, they will invariably acquiesce or accede to the direction of the US government. Now, why I say that that is interesting as a starting point when you then come to think about the Russian oil price circumvention is that according to the UK National Crime Agency, the NCA, the way that the Russian oil price cap circumvention system works is this. There are essentially two sides to it. There's what is called the red side and something else called the blue side. The red side is made up of players who primarily deal directly with the Russian state and Russian infrastructure. So I'm very happy to purchase oil or LNG from a Russian producer. I'm very happy as a ship owner to lift cargo directly from Russian ports, irrespective of whether it's being sold at a price below or above the price cap. I'm very happy to sell that across to usually China, India, where the oil is being bought. Now, on the red side, it essentially creates an alternative market. And if I'm a ship owner who is content with the nature of the business or the availability of business within the alternative market, the power of sanctions vis-a-vis me really is greatly diminished, if non-existent, because I know that even if the US impose secondary sanctions on me, I have an alternative market in which I can continue to prosper. But the red side or the alternative market isn't self-sufficient. And so there's the blue side. And then the blue side is where you have usually front companies who are players within the mainstream market. They're trying to get access to Western financing, shippers, ships, just general trading on the mainstream market. And what will inevitably happen is that they will end up dragging unwitting bona fide participants in the mainstream market along on this sanction circumvention trip that they're going on. Now, in this side of the market, secondary sanctions continue to play, or the fear of secondary sanctions continue to play a real deterring, well, they should at least continue to play a real deterring factor. And I think from my perspective and the perspective of people here as lawyers, what I find interesting is that the red side and the alternative market that has been created there is as a side of the market that has probably always existed to some extent. However, over the past few years, what we've seen is an increase in capacity both in terms of the ships available, but also in terms of, for example, one of the big discussions people have when it comes to the dark and shadow fleet is the lack of insurance. Well, they're also building insurance capacity. There was an announcement recently that India has recently approved up to 8 Russian insurers whose cover they're willing to accept for ships to enter into their ports. So capacity continues to build in this market and it becomes a real significant market. I think the last estimates of the quantity of the dark and shadow fleet say that they're about 17% of the total global fleet, tanker fleet, exists in the dark and shadow fleet. So it's a real market. Now, from disputes or just generally lawyers' perspective, I think one of the interesting thoughts is this. If you have quite a significant market that is designed to circumvent Western sanctions, it's reasonable to expect that, well, first of all, it's a real market. I know people call it different things, but it's a real market, and so disputes will arise. It's reasonable to expect that the contracts and charge parties that are being agreed into in that market are not governed by English law. It's all other laws of Western jurisdictions. It's also reasonable to expect that the way the parties are going to agree to resolve their disputes are going to involve coming to the English courts or London arbitration. And so there is a question as to whether there is a real shift currently happening and continuing to happen going forward of sort of legal capacity from what you might describe as Western jurisdictions, England, London, across the different jurisdictions. Now, I have some guesses as to what those jurisdictions might be, but what would be interesting, hopefully when we get to the audience participation section later, is to hear from people in the audience whether, as English lawyers, they are seeing cases that involve the red alternative market, and people from other jurisdictions to see whether they are receiving increased instructions in respect of advisory work, advocacy work, about the alternative market. And so on one analysis, at least, some might say that some of the sanctions have been a sort of own goal in that it's allowing or forcing, it's a matter of necessity being the mother of all invention, it's forcing the creation and shifting of capacity from Western jurisdictions to an alternative market. That is all I have to say. I'm sure I was
Koye. A very interesting insight into sanctions, not your typical, well, there's problems in paying because there's a sanction party. So thanks very much. Edward, we've had the English law perspective. So can you perhaps share some of your sort of Far East perspective on these kinds of topics?
Thank you, Nichola. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Edward. As Nicholas can mention, that I'm very privileged to be invited by Quadrant Chambers to attend this panel discussion and share with you from Hong Kong perspective about the topic that today we are focused on. Well, as we all know that global shipping is historically or still actually thrived on harmonization, like the common standards, predictable regulation, and open market. But all these are being at stake. Fragmentation is one of the key words now, which making a lot of challenges. Of course, also on the other hand, made a lot of works that actually to the lawyers as well. But the good point is that we still have the very consolidated common law system, English law system, to provide the certainty to the commercial world, especially for the global shipping market. But on the other hand, of course, that the issues or the challenges are evolving so rapidly, so that whether the law can really catch up with this kind of changes almost every day. And now it's indeed every day, actually, since January this year, right? We all know what is happening. So I want to share by my own experience about the real cases that I've been handling with to you, so that you can understand what is happening in the Hong Kong market as well, and what is really a concern by the Chinese or China-related ship owners and shipbuilders as well. And especially actually in Hong Kong, as you know, that we are positioned at the heart of this cross currents since actually 2019 or even earlier, because, for example, every time that the US government imposed the tariffs on China, now Hong Kong is included, despite Hong Kong is actually an independent tariff regime apart from China. And also like that in Hong Kong, we are deeply connected to mainland China's shipbuilding industry and also the supply chain. So that is indeed what we are tackling every day, the challenges. But on the other hand, actually, as you also know, that under the one country, two system, Hong Kong is anchored with the same legal system, the common law system, and offering a world-class resolution as well. For example, like in this year, the Crimaris International Arbitration Survey, Hong Kong is ranked number 2, together with Singapore, just follow London. So we are indeed a bridge to Asian capital as well, especially I will later explain why I think that when you are contracting with a Chinese party for the overseas clients, that Hong Kong is even a better ideal place for arbitration. So turning to the tariffs and trade fragmentation, as we all know that over the past 9 months, tariff and trade remedies has escalated sharply. And we, of course, all seen the news regarding the Madrid, the 4th round of negotiation between China and the US, and we hopefully that they can bring some certainty to this uncertain world instead of further escalation of uncertainty, right? But for the shipbuilding, that is indeed quite impacted already, that I've already seen. For example, the hull steel, propulsion electronics, and the navigation systems are now subject to different duties. And also, like the logistics costs rise as companies reroute supply chains and the dual source components. So one of the cases that I have recently handled is that I acted for a Greek ship owner in a dispute involving a mainland Chinese shipyard, and the yard procured bridge electronic manufactured in China. But something bizarre to us is that instead of sourcing them directly from the Chinese producer, they arranged the purchase through a US-linked distributor, possibly because of existing supply arrangement or financing terms that we have heard from when we were negotiating with the shipyard. And when additional US tariffs were unexpectedly imposed, the cost increased significantly, and delivery was delayed, and the buyer alleged breach of contract, viewing the change as an agreed variation. The matter was actually finally settled upon both lawyers' negotiation, and of course, the reality is that the Greek ship owner does not want to really cancel the order, because nowadays, the Chinese shipyard even rather prefer that you cancel the order, because they have many orders are waiting. And I heard that some of the Chinese shipyard, even the orders are up to already 2030 already. So that's 5 years later. But finally, that they also accept the reality and settled. The parties agreed to split the tariff costs using a clear routing matrix, extended delivery deadline with a capital liquidated damages, and also that we prepare the supplemental agreement to tackle about the future tariff sharing for the future systems. That if anything happen. As also you know that USTR 301 investigation is still there, and very likely I heard that the US government will proceed with the implementation of the 301 the decision in October this year. And I also heard that actually, because it's too complicated for already the trade talks between the two countries, so the commercial team from the Chinese government basically disregard about the request from the shipping industry about the 301 investigation as well. So that is the first case I want to share with you. The second is about geopolitical instability, which, as you know, for example, the Red Sea have become tangible issues for shipping as well. And I want to share a case that I handled last year involving a time charter where the charter ordered a transit skirting a declared high-risk zone. And the master, by exercising his own judgment, decided to deviate to a safe water. The charter immediately put the vessel off hire, saying that, well, actually, you have already agreed to sail to that port. And actually, it's fine because it's also a Chinese. Yeah, very interesting. The charters allege that the vessel was flying Hong Kong flag. And the charter said, because Chinese government are very good in that region, so the Chinese flagged vessel would not be attacked at all. So they say that, and as a defense to say that you should not deviate and put the vessel off hire. We built our case on two principles. The first one, as you all know, is about the unsafe port issue, the principle that we relied on. And I will not go to the details, but the second one is the war risk clause, which has incorporated into the charter party. And this allowed actually the master to refuse orders that exposed the vessel to abnormal war-like risks. And evidence was actually the key because we presented open source data showing a surge in attacks in the original corridor and the underwriters' circulars highlighting increased premiums. Even actually, because they say that the Chinese government has a very good relationship with the local, not really government, but local armed camp. And so we say, well, actually, the relevant Chinese embassy in those countries also issued a warning saying that be careful about the dangers that are posed to when transiting in that area. So again, we had the case had the early intervention mediation actually, and the mediator found indicated, of course, he could not find, but he indicated during the private session, which we heard that they indicated to the other side that if he was the arbitrator, he would definitely think that the deviation was reasonable, and the charters would have a very high risk of losing the case. So we also settled the terms that kept the vessel on hire, and also that we recover the war risk premiums. And they decided to pay almost 80% of the war premiums that we decide to purchase. So the third one regarding the sanction, which we have just heard from Koye, that is also quite a unique tension between, as you know, the contractual obligations as well as public law prohibitions. Well, I have to say that because of the US sanction on Russia, that indeed brought quite a few business opportunities to the Hong Kong lawyers as well, because some of the Russian parties are now have reviewed their contracts by changing the law from English law and by changing the venue of arbitration from London to Hong Kong. But of course, not all the Hong Kong firms can really handle those kind of issues, especially if they are from US or UK firms. They are quite concerned. But me, I'm as you have heard that I'm from a Chinese law firm, so we still have such kind of flexibility a little. But again, you know, every city, especially like Hong Kong, as an international financial center, everyone are scared about the US sanction. Even in Hong Kong, technically speaking, that US sanction is not really legal because we only recognize the UN sanction. But still, that no banks would really want to be captured by, that if they know the money is from any Russia-related companies. So that is another challenge actually for the Hong Kong lawyers to handle the Russian-related cases. But again, that we represented the charters and manager of a vessel caught in two vessels actually, caught in a sanction-related dispute. The midway through a bareboat charter, the owner group was alleged to be owned or controlled by a newly listed Russian entity under EU sanction instead of US sanction. And this was actually the same Russian parent company involved in the 2021 case, the Graveler Shipping and the GTLK Asia M5, which as many of you know actually. And the sanctions triggered a chain reaction. First of all, the banks de-risked by refusing to make a payment or receiving any payment. And the insurance and the classification society withdrew their certificates. And eventually a competent authority froze the vessels. And the vessel were arrested actually in Malta, EU port as well. So the dispute centered on the conflict between the charters held a high water clause, which requires performance and under all circumstances, which is also relied on by the owner, saying that the breach of my clients. But on the other hand, my clients actually from European country, which I don't want to name their name, but they're from the European country and are very concerned about the consequence of continuing the bareboat charter. So our defense for the charters and the managers rests on four key points. First, the illegality at the place of the performance, because we say that carrying out obligations like paying hire or arranging crew in EU jurisdictions would breach the asset freeze without a license. And basically that there's no possibility to apply for any kind of license actually based on my client's instruction. And secondly, suspension during sanctions events. The sanction clause allowed our clients to suspend obligations until the illegality was resolved. And thirdly, actually, because despite the vessel, there was some gray period that we declare even that we want to cancel, we want to terminate the charter party. But on the other hand, actually, the vessel was still performing under our client's instruction. And therefore that we signed a caretaker agreement. So under that caretaker only agreement, the activities were limited to safety critical services, such as crewing and bunkering in line with EU derogations. So that is allowed for simply the safety of the vessel and also the crew. And we narrow the scope of the manager's undertaking, because the manager's responsibility under the original managing undertaking is that they need to do whatever they can to manage the vessel, but we argued that is not allowed as well. So actually the recent English cases like the Havila Kistrutan and also the Graveler have helped our analysis. And the case actually is still ongoing. And we are quite actually confident that as long as the Hong Kong tribunal would like to follow the English decisions, that we think that the termination was actually legal. The last point that I'd like to say, because I'm again from Hong Kong, so I really want to use this opportunity to say a few words about how could we work together? Because actually, since I moved from international, actually UK firms, Hong Kong office, to now my current firm, I have quite more actually instructions from the UK's listers now working together to help them for example, like arrest of vessel and also enforcement of London laws in Hong Kong and as well as in mainland China. And well, actually, not to say that we play the same common law system. We have the, well, of course, not comparable with London, but we're still one of the leading arbitration jurisdictions in the world. What makes us more unique or different from all the other, I would say, the leading arbitration centers is that the certain arrangement between Hong Kong and mainland China, for example, the interim measure arrangement we are the only jurisdiction in the world that for Hong Kong, qualified arbitration can apply to the mainland courts for interim measure like the freezing order, not London, not Singapore. Okay, so sometimes, of course, it's a joke that when I was talking to if my counterparts are actually overseas and the overseas lawyers as well, that if I say it would constitute a professional negligence if you do not advise your clients to choose Hong Kong as the arbitration venue, because especially the counterparts is a Chinese party, because you can very easily to freeze its assets in mainland if they have, of course, and then to secure your claim, which is, as you know, that is a headache of the shipping industry, right? Because most of the charters are paper companies, either they register in Hong Kong, Singapore, or anywhere else. So that is indeed what we can offer, comparing with the other places. Of course, in Hong Kong, we have the Hong Kong Maritime Arbitration Group, which is actually quite identical to LMAA. And of course, with the thanks to LMAA's support, the HKMAG's rules are actually identical to LMAA terms as well, so that you will feel you will feel very familiar with the Hong Kong, especially maritime arbitration. So that's
Edward.
Translation.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting to have the English and the Far East insight too. We now have time for questions from the audience. I think there's going to be a roving microphone. Perhaps whilst the mic... Oh, there's a question already at the back.
Me? Thank you. The question for Edward Liu, just to take you up on your last point, that the selling point for Hong Kong is that the Hong Kong courts or the Chinese courts will grant interim relief or freezing orders over the assets of Chinese parties. Is it not a reason why mainland Chinese parties are going to be very reluctant to choose Hong Kong as a jurisdiction in which to arbitrate, and that their assets are going to be frozen?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gong, for your good question. Well, I'm now in London, so that I can sell from this angle of the story, right? That to encourage the overseas companies to choose Hong Kong because of the intermeasure arrangement to secure your claim. Of course, I have to say that indeed it's definitely a coin of two sides. And in the same region that actually we are being criticized or being our competitor actually using this for persuading the Chinese parties not to choose Hong Kong as well, saying that okay, if you choose some of the other arbitration center, then you see that the other side would not secure your assets. But on the other hand, I think that's a shame, right? Because we all want to actually in a even arena to fight the case. And for example, like if it is a London arbitration and you found that actually the opposing party have the assets in Hong Kong, you would come to Hong Kong and apply for marine injunction, just like under English law. But there's no way actually traditionally for anywhere else that for the arbitration to secure the claim if the other side is in China. And that is indeed sometimes that we cannot really proceed with the case because finally we decided to, because we found no assets or they have already dissipated their assets away. So good point, good observation, but that is indeed that I'm in London. So I think this, what I said is still valid.
Koye, you mentioned when you were giving your insight that actually changing seat of arbitration, changing the choice of law is the difference perhaps between the red market and the blue market, I think you mentioned. Do you think that people on the blue market will still use English arbitration, govern their contracts by English law?
I think so. I think the idea is because the blue market players or the blue side players who are trying to circumvent sanctions are doing so usually obscuring their real intention and trying to deal with the main market. mainstream market, the things that normally go on in the mainstream market will carry on going on. So you're going to have English law charge parties, LMA arbitration. And so in a sense, nothing I don't expect will change in that from that perspective. I think where there could be, and I think one can reasonably expect change is when you're dealing in solely alternative market disputes.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, I want to ask James one on decarb. He's here. We may as well ask him about it. Right, I'm going to ask you your chosen specialist subject, pure EU maritime. You have been advising, you said during your talk, about different types of clauses that people have been used. BIMCO have one out. How widely accepted is the BIMCO version?
In all honesty, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously a very good place to start, and as these clauses go, is a pretty good one. It has, I think, two flaws. One major, one is more of a niggle. The major flaw is that it's really contemplates that the vessel in question will be producing a compliance deficit, and it's really all geared around that. It's less convincing if you actually think the ship is going to be delivering a compliance surplus. And there isn't that much in there, certainly not that much in there that's, as it were, compulsory in terms of the clause for handling a compliance surplus. And that is it's understandable, but I think that a flaw in the clause. The more minor thing, which is more of a niggle, is the way that it handles the aggregated compliance deficit at the end of the charter period. If you read that bit of the clause, you can see that if you allow it to operate to the default, it says you just look at the last bit of compliance deficit that was generated and you stick there, and that's actually just flawed in terms of the proper approach. The way that it works is that as you go along voyage by voyage or month by month, you continue to settle up between charterer and owner based on the compliance deficit that you're generating. But it assumes that you can just look back to the last month and that will be an aggregate of what you've done. But it won't necessarily. And that if you allow the clause to run as a default, it definitely won't be. And then the clause doesn't work. And I've raised this with BIMCO. They agree with me, and they're going to cover this in their guidance notes, they said. But the more major question mark over it is the handling of compliance surpluses. So if you're the owner or indeed the charterer of, say, a ship that can burn LNG, so for the next sort of 5 or 10 years you'll be generating surpluses, then it's not that convincing an arrangement. But it's still better than anything else I've seen, but it's not that.
Presumably it provides a framework for these discussions to be had and tweaking the clause between owner and charterer depending where the balance of power lies.
As ever, be careful what you tweak. But but there's I don't know if anyone here has heard of Weezer, the band. They have a very good song which has the line, "If you want to destroy my sweater, hold this thread while I walk away." And there's a bit of an element of that with clauses of that sort, because it's very carefully drafted, and it would be easy to start sort of rewriting bits of it and just not realizing how that's going to pan out. But yes, it's certainly a starting point. It's got some blanks that the parties can fill in and so on.
Perhaps just one final question for you, Edward. Decarbonisation, do you see that as being a potential future for disputes from the Far East perspective, or is that very much down the pecking order after tariff sanctions and everything else we're dealing with?
Thank you, Nico. Very, very short answer. Actually, I don't want to be too optimistic because just like I remember before COVID, we had the sulfur cap, and actually for all the shipping lawyers were very excited to think that we would have the floodgate of disputes from that. But finally, it turns out that actually there are not too many disputes from that. But on the other hand, indeed, for the new fuels, the green fuels, China will be the major suppliers for that. Either it's ammonia or methanol or LNG. So we do hope, I would say, that more off-spec dispute will arise. But on the other hand, just like now the EVs that we sometimes say, it's actually less engine breakdown or the disputes from those kind of new products. So I don't know, but yeah, but sometimes indeed for the new things that we bring the new disputes that we can capture.
But just to jump in on that, and I think Ed was absolutely right. The new fuels, as and when they come on stream, and we all know that there are great problems at the moment with scaling it up and making it available, and also playing catch up with ships that can actually burn them and so on, because there are very few dual fuel ammonia capable vessels out there at the moment. One of the big problems is going to be certification. And people like DNV are ahead of the game on that score, but we've already seen problems arising with biofuels being certified when they shouldn't have been. Now, that is just the sort of thing that can give rise to a dispute. If it turns out that your certificate was improperly given or didn't apply to that stem or whatever, and suddenly that unravels some of the arrangement that you've made in order to grapple with Fuel EU, then that is just the sort of thing that could give rise to disputes. Who bears the risk of effectively fraudulent certificates? We've all been used to that with bills of lading and 5-10 container loads of copper, which have suddenly turned into cement dust in the course of the voyage. It won't turn into cement dust, but you may find that your green ammonia turns out to have been blue or grey, and that will lead to arguments for sure.
Can I just add one point? Well, it's one of the cases I'm handling. It's not new fuel; it's a conventional fuel. But the problem is that we act for the Hong Kong supplier, and we are being sued by the Singapore bunker supplier, which is the major bunker supplier there. And they say that the bunker that we supplied is off-spec. The reason is because that they say it's not really compliant with the EU requirement. But actually, we now provide a certificate saying that we are in compliance with everything that in Hong Kong, and also that's the international standard. So again, I think the uncertainty created is the regional framework instead of the global framework. So that we do hope that in October even now it's uncertain, but still that we hope the international framework for the GHG strategy can be adopted by the IMO. Yeah, so that bring a global regulation instead of the regional regulations.
I feel like I should add something, but I don't actually have anything to add.
It's interesting you should say.
Shall we have coffee now? I'm sure you'll agree, each member of our panel has more than earned their cup of coffee now. So I would really like to draw our speaking part of this session to a close and invite you to join us all for a networking for around half an hour. But before you do, can I just ask you to show your appreciation in the old-fashioned way and give them a round of applause?